We did earlier touch on the topic of smart cities and inequality, and I believe we will now hear some more about this on the topic of why smart cities fail and how to make them succeed. A warm welcome to James Evans, professor at the University of Manchester.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Good afternoon, folks. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. The sun's shining, and Helsingborg's hosting an expo. It really is fantastic. Thanks so much to Mikkel for the invitation to speak here, and to Lisa for giving me a summary of what was said this morning. I'm at the University of Manchester, in the Manchester Urban Institute there, where I've been for about 15 years researching the topic of sustainable cities. I was lucky enough to spend a year based in Lund at the IIIEE, the Institute for Ecological Economics, my Swedish inte bra, so I will stick to English for all of our sakes. Great. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about smart cities in the general sense, what they're promising, and then work through some of the places we've been with smart cities over the last 10 years. So hopefully give a bit of the broader context. And then towards the end, I will try and answer this rather ambitious title I set myself about how we can make smart cities work. I'm a geographer by background, so apologies, this will be a whistle-stop tour around the world. I may ask you if you know where some of these places are as well. There will not be a test at the end, though. So some obvious stuff, and you know, you guys work in this. Skåne is one of the most innovative regions in the world around addressing urban challenges and sustainable challenges, but it's useful to help situate why cities are the focus for some of the kind of technological hype at the moment. The graph up the top is quite familiar. It's the UN projections of global population growth, and you can see as of about 2008 we became an urbanized species for the first time, and we will become an increasingly urbanized species towards the end of this century. Cities themselves are facing a number of dynamic challenges. One we've just heard about, the challenge around aging populations. Cities also produce about 80% of the world's emissions. We've got other challenges like automation, displacement of jobs, and of course over on the left, inequalities among populations that live in cities. So people are focusing on cities. How do we change cities? How do we make them more sustainable? We're hearing a lot about net zero cities at the moment. I think Helsingborg is one of the 100 net zero cities in the world. So this is ground zero for that kind of challenge. We're in the midst of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we're supposed to achieve, again, as a species by 2030. And SDG 11 focuses on cities and making them sustainable. I won't dwell on the bottom left. This is nonsense from the UK. Boris's latest nonsense around levelling up, which is all going to be done through towns, apparently. The bottom right is something I think that holds in most parts of the world, though. This is my very poor attempt at a graph showing municipal funding trends. So essentially, over time, local governments are being given less and less money. They're being asked to do more and more. So suddenly, you know, we've had a talk about aging. You'll be hearing about flooding. There's technology. Local authorities are magically supposed to be able to deal with all of these things, develop strategy, implement policy with less and less funding. So there's a gap there too, which I think is driving change around how local government might do things differently, how it might organize itself differently as well. And of course, technology and the promise of technology speaks to all of these kind of broader agendas. So what we've got essentially with the smart city agenda is cities trying to understand how to harness technologies, digital technologies, to deliver better outcomes for the people who live there, but also to improve the efficiency with which the city is run, so operational efficiencies, but also to improve democratic engagement, to somehow find new ways to engage citizens with all sorts of different aspects of the city. What we have, of course, is a whole profusion of diagrams, schematics like this that show this fantastical idealized city where everything is connected together by IoT sensors that speak to each other so we can manage everything more efficiently and join everything up. And this is really where the smart city debate from a technological point of view was at maybe 10 years ago. Instrument everything, connect everything. And of course, it became quite a hyped term. There was a lot of hype around it. This was a figure that was bandied about an awful lot, that the global smart city market would be worth $1.5 trillion by 2020. The observant amongst you will notice that that's in the past, that projection. We're in 2022. Do you think the global smart city market is worth $1.5 trillion now? Hands up if you think that. Hands up if you don't think that. Was it a leading question? You're right, it's worth about half that. So this is a very hyped thing. 10 years ago, this was the answer for cities, and there was an awful lot of hype around it. Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, really pushed it, saying this is the way we improve the life of billions of people around the world. We deploy technology in cities. So do we have some kind of new social contract with technology whereby services that the state deliver, smart can build it around our needs, we'll get better access to information about all aspects of living in the city. We'll have increased input into public sector decision making through digital technology. We'll have nicer places to live and work, better services. And of course, this is the bit cities were very interested in for the leaders. Would it enable them to become more effective, make better decisions, have more evidence, be more convinced that this was what the people actually wanted? But of course, the reality has panned out slightly differently, or it's certainly thrown up a few things that we now need to really give some serious thought to. One of which is growing inequality. On the right, an example that is fairly close to home, the growing permeation of electric vehicles into fleets. There's an awful lot of benefits to owning an electric vehicle, and that was before the price of fuel went through the roof. But you need quite a lot of money to buy an electric vehicle. There's the second-hand, the oldest electric vehicles on the second-hand market are only a few years old and cost large amounts of money. So those benefits of owning electric vehicles tend to accrue to richer members of the population. Poorer members of the population are stuck using older vehicles, which are paying higher amounts of tax and are more expensive to run. And you probably can't charge them, well, you definitely can't fill them up for free at work, like you can many workplaces for EVs. And this is going to become more of a problem, not less of a problem over the next decade. On the left, an example a little bit further from home. This is solar power in southern Australia. Now, Australia, sun shines a lot, born for solar. So a lot of homeowners adopted solar panels on their roofs in southern Australia and disconnected from the grid because they can make far more energy than they need. There weren't great feed-in tariffs because up until recently they had a fairly climate skeptic government. And they stopped paying bills to the national utilities. But of course, the national utilities use a part of that bill to maintain the national grid, the infrastructure. So as the richer homeowners who own their home and can afford lots of solar panels disconnect, the cost of maintaining that infrastructure is now being borne increasingly by poorer populations. So we've got these kinds of problems as well, whereby the kind of old-style infrastructure, the costs of maintaining that are now falling increasingly on a smaller and less affluent population. So the promise was technology will save us. But what I've started to question is whether smart does equal sustainable. Does it really deliver sustainability outcomes? 5 challenges Smart cities often tend to reinforce the idea of economic growth. They're not suggesting that somehow we could move away from economic growth and do more with less. They tend to focus on more affluent populations. A lot of smart solutions are about more efficient allocations of scarce resources. So often they actually just encourage more use of resource because you can get it for cheaper. They disempower and marginalize some citizens who can't engage with some of these digital schemes. They tend to neglect environmental protection, and they fail to challenge these prevailing consumerist cultures. So a classic would be smart meters, which are incentivizing people to use less electricity themselves to save money. And I'll come back to that later on in the talk. So at the moment, really, what you've seen over the last 10 years is the development of these two critiques of smart cities. The old model was the state model. People were citizens. It was about fairness. You delivered public goods that were the same for everyone. The neoliberal economic model, which drives a lot of smart city initiatives, they come out of the private sector. People are seen as consumers, sorry. The logic is to generate profit, and you're getting private goods. And people engage through buying, right? You engage through using an app or buying something. And we also got these other set of critiques, which are, I guess, technocentric in their nature, that technology has infiltrated service delivery. People are just data points. You collect data on them that you use to improve your product. The logic is efficiency based around optimized resource allocation. So that's the kind of broad pitch of where we are at, what the promise was, and some of the challenges that have come up. Now for the whistle-stop tour through the phases of smart cities. Anyone know where this is? Good guess. Better guess. Better guess. Who said Brazil? Yeah, where in Brazil? Rio. Spot on. This is Rio. Rio got on the smart city map because it was one of the first cities in the world to install a all-singing, all-dancing smart city control room in 2012. Partly put in ahead of some major events like the Olympics in 2016, installed by IBM, traffic feeds from all over the city, all sorts of feeds around weather and data coming in, people movements, the idea that you can somehow have better control over a city, control traffic, control people, respond to crises, all very appealing. Didn't work out so well. Never really functioned too well at all because IBM installed a whole bunch of software which wasn't really tailored to the problem at hand. And the real problem was they didn't find they were actually improving much. Yes, they were managing problems, but they weren't dealing with the root of those problems. Why was there too much traffic in some places? Why were people living in areas that were prone to flooding? And in some ways, it was the dream of controlling the city, just in technological format. This might be a harder one, possibly, I don't know. Can anyone tell me where this is an aerial view of? God, it's an easier one. You are a cultured audience. It's just, yep, that's Paris. So with this view, you can see really clearly the boulevards that were created in Paris in the 19th century. And these boulevards were undertaken by an urban planner called Haussmann. And they were undertaken in order to make the city more controllable. Paris had had a lot of unrest, rioting, and so on. And the previous urban layout was just all small streets, cobbled streets, wiggledy streets. You couldn't see it. People could hide. Hard to police. So Haussmann boulevardized Paris to enable essentially the control of the city. Easier to get large numbers of troops in, to put down uprisings and so on. There's a classic piece of modernist planning, right? Sight lines enable the movement of resources around the city more efficiently, control populations that live there more efficiently. That is just the smart city equivalent of that from 150 years previously. So the classic problem with this early approach of we'll somehow instrument everything and get all the data in so we can control the city better was it didn't really address any of the causes. Certainly in Rio, the problems were around inequality, poor planning, people living in the wrong places. This control room did nothing to address that. The kind of second iteration with smart cities was more around services, the provision of services. Uber, Airbnb are probably two of the better known ones, where people were seen as consumers and data points. And this was really around the more efficient allocation of scarce resources. So the reason Uber's been effective everywhere in the world is that most cities suffer from congestion. So transport time is a scarce resource for all of us. Doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich. Not many people can hop in a helicopter to get across town. So Uber is essentially optimizing transport times for us in cities. But of course, there's a whole lot of interesting developments here whereby technology is being inserted in all sorts of places to provide services, whether it's robot hoovers providing the service of cleaning your house, or the promise of fridges that will do your shopping for you. And of course, there's a hell of a lot of data now being generated. A lot of these service companies actually describe themselves and register for tax purposes as technology companies based on data. A lot of Uber's legal wrangles have been over whether it should be registered as a transport company, whereas it registers as a technology company. And this has created, I guess, this iteration of the smart city has created a lot of concerns around data justice. So we're familiar with the idea that there's a lot of data in the world. 90% of the world's data was collected in the last 2 years. But there's a serious question over who holds this data. Privacy issues, who has access to it? Do the regulations of governments effectively police who has access to data and who can do what with it? And of course, the asymmetry between tech companies that have experts on data, government that are playing catch up, and most citizens who have very little idea about data from a privacy point of view, or in terms of who holds what. And this has really exacerbated the kind of digital divide in society, whereby people who can access digital devices do understand around data, have some idea what's going on in terms of their lives and the information about them, whereas people who don't have access to those devices and don't have any level of digital literacy have no idea at all what Facebook are doing to their data. And of course, the way it's happened is through promising services, in this case, the cell phone that has a camera and plays music, and also tracks you, but we won't tell you that, and people want it. And of course, Facebook do exactly the same. They offer you a service for free. What they're actually doing is you're getting the service because you give them your data, and the small print says they can do anything they want with it. There's a coffee chain in the UK called Pret a Manger. I don't know if it's here, but they had a deal during lockdown that you could have unlimited drinks for £20 a month. That's like 200 Swedish krona. Unlimited, as many as you want, every day. Has to be only for you. You can't buy everyone in this room a drink. And I was talking to someone who worked there. I said, how this must be, because they're still doing it. It's insane. I said, how are you not bankrupt? She said, the company, you have to sign up all this stuff to get the deal, and then they sell the data. They're making that much money out of selling the data. So data's big business. And this idea of inequality of who owns the data is a big issue. This is something a bit different, but something that I think is becoming increasingly important. This is from our own smart city data platform in Manchester that hosts real-time data around traffic, people movements, air quality, river levels, and a bit of metadata. And you can see real clusterings And some of the clusters map quite neatly onto places, but some of them don't really. You get places like Lee, which is one of the least advantaged places in the entire of the UK, that has one traffic centre. Oldham as well, almost nothing. Whereas some of the places, and even in Manchester, anywhere around the south tends to have significantly more sensors. And what people have noticed is that sensor positioning often correlates quite well with socioeconomic demographics. So poorer areas often end up with less sensors in them. And of course, if you're coming back to that control room idea, this is a big problem, because it means you're finding out, you're a lot more aware of conditions in some places than others. And this is some work that I've been loosely involved with, looking at the idea of sensor deserts and the implications for decision-making and justice in the city. This idea that there are areas with no sensors. And you can think it through in terms of different kinds of injustice. Distributional injustice suggests that it's just wrong that these forms of technology aren't distributed more evenly. Recognition injustice is the logical next step of that. If you don't have sensors there, then you don't know if there's a problem there. You don't know what those groups are struggling with. So how are you then meant to recognize that fact? It also means that these people aren't involved in placements of sensors as well. So like many resources in the city, more affluent communities tend to be slightly better at arguing to get those resources. So they often do a better job of making the case that maybe the air quality needs monitoring in their part of town. And then finally, of course, procedural injustice that this leads to. So increasingly we see claims for resources, whether it's cycle lanes or reductions of traffic, or some kinds of measures to improve air quality based on data. And of course, if you don't have that data, your claims are going to be secondary to the people who do. So this is becoming a really big issue, essentially, in terms of how cities are supposed to use this kind of technology to make better decisions. And if you talk to most people who deploy sensors, it comes down to things like, oh, that's where the planners said they might put something in 3 years' time, or it turns out the lampposts in that area are managed by a contractor that has the right sockets to plug the sensors in. It's all, a lot of it isn't conspiracy. There's no one saying don't put any sensors in poor places. It's often for, there are reasons, but the end result is this, that we are producing these sensor deserts that are further not only not improving inequalities, but making them worse. So there's some serious issues have come out of this kind of second wave of smart cities around services and data. And some of the challenges are, we've just talked about the second one, the challenges around big urban data, technocratic governance, and so on. But the first one, I think, is also important. So going back to the smart meter example, people are essentially being motivated to save energy by saving money. And it's them in their house and it's their money. People have started to say, maybe that's not the right motivational device. Maybe people might actually care about saving the planet in its own right, rather than just because it will save them a small amount of money. Or maybe people would care more about using less energy if we could then subsidize energy for people who can't afford to heat their own homes, for example, which I assume is a problem here, as well as the UK. So one of the biggest problems of this kind of service data approach to smart cities was it locked in a very economic, individualistic kind of approach to sustainability, which wasn't really going to get us where we needed in either environmental or social terms. And this is a fairly famous quote: if technology was the answer, what was the question? Cedric Price was an architect, I think, post-war architect in the UK. And this is really where we've seen in the last maybe 5 years, people and places striking back a bit, both against the idea that smart cities are something that can be imposed from the top down, or that if you just let private companies come in and offer fantastic things like mobility as a service, then all the city's problems will be magically fixed. So Håvard Harstad, a Norwegian researcher on this, has said the smart city is not underpinned by an ideology. It would make a good exam question. We're not going to go into that too much at the moment, other than to say it probably reflects the environment it's being inserted into. Rob Kitchen, a very famous scholar in the smart city world, says smart cities should serve the interests of all their residents in equal measure, and identifies 2 problems. He says what's been happening in the past is people are doing things apparently on behalf of citizens, or paternalism. People have been doing what they think is best for citizens. So the final element is really thinking about what the alternative is. And the alternative here is at the bottom of this diagram, bottom-up smart cities. Citizens generating their own data, sharing their own data, connecting with each other, and improving the way they interact as communities and with their cities from the bottom up. This kind of initiative, which I think was Vancouver, was quite innovative 5 or 6 years ago. In fact, it's 2014, almost 10 years ago. It isn't so innovative anymore. The idea that communities might pool together resources, whether it's children's toys, household tools, gardening equipment, and share it to give people access who can't afford their own, and to prevent everyone from having to buy their own. Makes perfect sense. Works better as a bottom-up initiative. And this comes back to what kinds of different ethics can technology generate. This is a quote from my colleague Stephanie Pinsettle at UCLA. Smart cities should be ones where care and generosity are the traits that make them smart. So we should be thinking about how to use more effective resource reallocation to address social inequality, not just to save a few pennies or address congestion. I'm a geographer. I would say this, but place does matter. This is a tricky one. Anyone tell me where this is? I'll give you a country. Nope. A continent. Asia. Yes, we have a winner. This place is called Songdo in South Korea. It's about 20 miles from Seoul, and it was built from scratch as a smart city. And it's not been a great success because everything was constructed in a totally top-down way. There was no community there to start with. Everything was instrumented without any idea of what the people there would actually need. And it's not really been a success. No one wants to live there. Place really does matter. In so many ways, places are where people live and engage and have needs. Places have needs, but places have specific needs. What works in one place won't work perfectly in another. And this idea that you can take one smart technology and simply drop it into different places hasn't really got very far. Even a company like Uber have actually had to adapt far more to different national contexts than they would ever admit to. So in most parts of Africa, Uber drivers are allowed to accept cash as well, for example, for obvious reasons. So I think this is a nice way to think about it. Smart technologies and urban environments are kind of recursively related. They are transforming each other over time. How to make smart cities work then? We're going on about this bottom-up stuff. Well, the first thing is you have to engage people and understand what people need. The example on the right, I first came across biobuses on a smart city project in Stavanger a few years ago. So biobuses are kind of fueled by gas, but the gas is made out of people's poo. And people love it. People absolutely love this. It makes the press. School kids get excited about it. Everyone sits on the bus chuckling that their own poo is moving them around. Really great way to engage people. Smart energy, it doesn't matter what you do. You can host however many open days, information shots, create apps for people that don't care. They don't care. They can't see it, they don't get it, just comes out the wall when you need it. No way. You have to engage people with smart cities, and it needs to be showing them how technology can do something good, like take a waste material, their own waste material, and turn that into a service, moving them about. On the left, the disputes in London recently that tried to ban Uber, and one of the main reasons they didn't ban Uber was women saying this is how we get around safely at night. It's only because of Uber that I can now go and safely move around the city at night. And it really switched people on to the idea that technology could open up an aspect of urban living for people who weren't white males, essentially. The data ethics piece. People are thinking more about data activism. How do we use data to actually force change? Data justice. How do we use data to prove that injustices are happening? Who can tell me where this picture is? Yeah, United States. You want to take a guess of the city? Yeah, excellent. Good audience. So my friend Stephanie Pinsetto works on urban metabolism, and she tries to understand resource flows through different parts of the city. And one of the things we've been talking about for ages is why when you do sustainability initiatives, it's always focused on poor people. It's people who already don't have much. It's getting people who live in a flat to shower for 5 minutes less every day to save a bit of energy. Which, when you think about it, is rubbish, because rich people consume all the resources, right? We know this. And she was really looking to do some work on this in LA. And basically her argument was we should be focusing on the people with the mansions in Bel Air, getting them to reduce their energy use, because even per meter squared, their energy use is much higher than people who live in average parts of LA. How could she do it, though? Why am I talking about this under a slide that says data ethics? It's very hard to come across data on domestic energy use. It all exists. The power companies have it all. They probably know how much electricity every single house in the UK or the US uses, but they won't give it to anyone. So she actually went through the courts in California to force the energy companies to give up some of their data, not on a house-by-house basis, but on a neighborhood level, so that she could accurately see what the actual energy use was relating to different housing types and different socio-demographic segments. And then she was essentially saying, being a data activist, she could then use this to show data injustice. The fact that this data isn't being shared is preventing us from seeing yet another injustice in the city. And of course, it all comes back to questions of data ownership. Who should own this data? Like, if we actually need that data aggregated to a certain level to effectively target energy reduction measures in a city and meet net zero targets, maybe it shouldn't be owned purely by the energy companies. And just one final thing on that. I think this is where the European Union are going with their efforts around data as well, saying that if the data was generated by you, you should have some ownership or say over it, whether it's being paid if someone else wants to use it, or at least being able to access it So I think where they're going with this is we should be able to demand to see and use the data that various organizations hold on us. This is absolutely critical and only comes from understanding communities and places. Technology has to address actual needs. The picture on the left is from some work we did in Kenya, in an informal settlement called Kibera, on water. Well, we were doing work on smart technology more generally and seeing how it was being deployed by local groups. This was my favorite example, though, which was some local lads who'd set up a company sticking sensors in water towers, and they'd created a really simple app so that people who lived there could see how much water was in all the different water towers that served their area. Just to zoom out for a second, this is an informal settlement with no drinking water. So people have to walk and queue, often for 1 or 2 hours, to get water and then take it home. Well, a big problem was people would start queuing, they'd queue for 2 hours, they get to the front of the queue, sorry, tower's empty, no water. They have to walk to another tower, queue there. So this fiendishly simple approach, just basic sensors and an app, has saved people who live in this settlement many, many hours, millions of hours of wasted time. And of course, the people who were queuing for the water were women and children, predominantly. So it's opened up much more time for education, to access healthcare, maybe to earn money. So just a fantastic example. And that was not some big company coming in. It was not the local government. It was these kids who lived there. The one on the right is something a bit more, I guess, developed world. It's a graph that did the rounds in the UK a couple of years ago. Local authorities called it the graph of doom, which basically showed that the amount of money they spend on adult social care and children's services was going to exceed their entire budget by next year. Adult social care and children's services are important because in the UK, local authorities are legally obliged to provide those services. They can't not provide them. Everything else, turns out, they can not bother with, but they have to do that. So that was going to outstrip their entire budget. Now, how many smart city projects have you ever seen that address adult social care and children's services? It's very few for me. I think maybe the previous talk is doing good work in that sense, although I didn't understand all of it. But you know, you talk to smart city projects, we'll do energy, we'll do mobility, maybe we'll do some aspect of health, maybe we'll do green infrastructure, we do all this amazing, clever stuff. But for local authorities, at least in the UK, those are the two things that are keeping them awake at night. Technology companies don't know that. They don't know that. I don't think many people know that, to be honest. It certainly bears no relationship to the emphasis I see in terms of where technology is used and resources are placed. So the conclusion, I guess I'm not a pessimist. Technological change is going to happen anyway. Whether we engage with it or not, it will happen, and it will just reflect what is already happening in society. It will exacerbate inequalities. It will make the good things even better. So it needs to be steered. It has to be steered. The question, of course, is how we steer it towards the right outcomes. A few pointers, I think, from having looked at what a number of places are doing around this. It has to be needs-led. It has to be driven by a real practical need in a place. If you're struggling to find one, maybe you're looking in the wrong place. It needs to be place-based and understand that different places have slightly different issues and different contexts, and people will expect different things. And this means essentially it's more time-consuming and more expensive than a lot of companies would like it to be. It has to be engaging. If you want it to be needs-led, you need to understand what people's needs are. And if you want to do that, you have to talk to them. And that works best when they actually want to talk to you. So you have to find ways to somehow capture people's imagination, because if you do that, it will empower them. The final point I wonder whether we won't be talking about smart cities for much longer. It feels to me like the debate is moving on. Who can tell me the Disney reference to the bottom right? It's culture now, not geography, culture. Yeah, it's We Don't Talk About Bruno from Encanto. So I'm wondering whether we're moving towards a point where we don't talk about smart. We don't talk about smart cities. I see the EU placing much more emphasis on digital again. But what I see in cities is, and what I feel as a researcher is, we should be talking about a process, not a thing. Smart cities are a thing. Smart technology is a thing. What I've been talking about today essentially is that it needs a process around it. So how do we come up with a process that will be needs-led, place-based, engaging, empowering? What I see a lot of cities doing is setting up divisions, units on urban innovation. I don't mind urban innovation as a topic. It's a process. How do we innovate, but specifically in an urban context? So this is not saying we can do it like IBM and set up some R&D department. This is something different. And that's the thought I would leave you with, that the way in which cities innovate is something different. And there's not been enough thought or effort put into that. We tend to borrow ideas and concepts and approaches from a whole range of other walks of life and suggest that somehow cities are just a bit like this, a bit like that. No, I think there's something special required in cities if we're going to make sure that we innovate in ways that genuinely address things like inequality and the problems that we're facing. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Are there any questions right away? I'd love to hear, you talked pretty thoroughly now about what you would like the solutions to look like. Like, what do you think they need to be like to be really efficient and really, give us something? Do you have any examples of what you see as like underused solutions, something that would be really helpful that you have seen somewhere, but you've only seen it once, like, and it should be everywhere?
What a great question. I think some of the smart health stuff is probably somewhat underused. So simple things like people being able to stay in their homes, especially older people. I'm aware now I'm moving into territory that was probably covered in much better depth before. But just things like, is that person moving around? Has the fridge been opened today? There's some very basic things, and if that hasn't happened, someone needs to go and check. Now, some health authorities are starting to use this kinds of technology, but I wonder why it's being done in a very top-down fashion. It wouldn't be that hard for neighbours to perform that function, or families, close family, because smartphones it's not hard to set that up so that you can see where someone's moving or where they've moved that day. So it feels to me,
you didn't need to go to the authorities. It could go to your child or your grandchild instead. That information, is that what you're saying?
I feel that is the case. A bit like during the pandemic, it wasn't like someone invented Zoom because COVID hit. All the tools were there already. We just weren't using them as much or in as many ways as we can. So, and again, it comes back to this idea of what innovation is. The classic definition of innovation is the cleverest people in the world come up with something even fancier and more amazing. I don't think that's not urban innovation. Urban innovation is mostly about taking things that already exist and trying to understand how to articulate them into your setting.
So let's turn it around. What about overused solutions?
I really love transport as a topic, but I am getting sick of mobility as a service. I wonder how much more of that we're going to have. Do you ride electric scooters? Yeah. They're everywhere here. Everywhere. And 3 or 4 different companies scattered all over the place. I'm quite a fan, but I do wonder how much more we need of that kind of thing.
And in what places? They seem to be, yeah, that sounds like a good example to me of an overused solution because it's really solving a problem in some contexts. But again, right now it is everywhere. Like in the city of Lund, where you used to live and where I currently live, there used to be people riding their bikes everywhere. And now that suddenly we also have the electrical scooters, I can't really see why we needed them because we have cobblestones in the city. So it's like we don't even have a good, we don't even have good infrastructure for the bikes. Plus the distances aren't so far that you couldn't ride a normal bike or whatnot, but we're still having them. So it seems a little overused for sure. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Or thoughts? I thought it was interesting that you quoted someone saying that it should be the smart city should be for serving all the citizens in equal measure, something like that, all the residents. And I was just thinking, well, we're not doing that with any other service or technology, unfortunately. So I wanted to ask you how you feel about that. Like, does that mean that we're never going to succeed with this because we're not really succeeding with non-smart, old school technology in doing that? Or do we have a unique chance now to start over and actually do it right this time? Because we're doing a very active effort to introduce the smart component so we could do it right if we just think about it.
I think that's where Rob Kitchen was going with that quote, was that this technology should actually, if we used it to engage communities that are less engaged, it should actually improve the level of engagement across the city. It should make it more equal than we've been able to manage. But of course, what's happening is the opposite. It's people who are into that kind of thing and into the technology that download the apps and do it. I mean, one thing that has changed is I remember interviewing city planners maybe 15 years ago and I was talking to them about how they experiment with new ways of doing things, like whether it's new road layouts or new services through the council website. And they were very hesitant. They said, we don't really do too much of that because it's seen as providing a better service to some people than other people. And we certainly don't like the word experiment because that suggests we don't know what we're doing and we're testing things on people. Now, you move on 15 years and everything's an experiment and a pilot, and everyone's like, yes, we'll just test this and demonstrate it and innovate it. And that's a double-edged sword. It's great on one side that there's appetite for trying new things, but the danger is, you have to have a way. If it works, how does everyone benefit from it? What you tend to find is cities try things and they're successful, and they don't tend to spread or scale up or roll out. So that's a key challenge. How do you make sure that if something good does happen that delivers better outcomes, it can scale? And that becomes an organizational challenge, and that kind of comes back to the challenge of, do we need to think about how to restructure elements of local government and get rid of silos and enable innovation that is plugged into, okay, we have a region-wide problem. If we try this here and it works, it will then determine the policy for how we address this at a much bigger scale. You don't see that joined upness at the moment.
Last chance for a question. Yeah, just a second.
Okay, more and more people live in cities, so I understand the focus on cities. But if you think about it, people in cities, they live close to public and private services. So the smartness, shouldn't this be more on the country, in the countryside, in the periphery, more need for smart solutions?
It's a really good question. And yes, in some ways, the more distant you are from services, the more upside there is to smart technology. So you look at examples of smart health from rural Africa, where communities that had no access to healthcare or had to travel for a day to access it, they love being able to talk to a doctor on a screen. It's amazing. Whereas you look at what's happened in parts of Europe where during COVID you talk to a doctor on a screen or a phone, and then now COVID's gone, no one wants it because they feel like the face-to-face was better. So the smart thing is worse than what we had. So there's that whole relative thing. I think the focus on cities, especially in the developed world, is simply because such a large proportion of the population live there. So it's seen as where the lower hanging fruit is. Like everything else, that's the reason why the countryside get neglected all over, isn't it? You have to spend more per person to get the outcome. But in principle, it should be more use.
The list that you've shown at the end, this is how we need to do it. Is this, whose responsibility is that? Is it a local government issue to make sure that it's needs-based, that it's engaging, etc., or is it for the private sector to be responsible of this? Or how do you
That's a really good question. I think luckily, the private sector has been struggling to deploy a lot of smart technologies in cities for long enough now that they realize they need to think about it differently, approach it differently. So I think they're on board with some of these ideas around needing to engage with places, communities, and government. But essentially it does come down to municipalities and local governments. You look at how Barcelona created an office where any approach from any technology company had to go through this office, and they had to show how they'd spoken to a part of the city administration and were addressing a problem that administration had told them about. Without that, you didn't even get a meeting. It was just an email saying, go and talk to someone who actually has a problem for you to fix for your technology. So it can be done.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to James Evans for making it here today and giving us this very interesting presentation. I know you need to run for your train, so thanks.
Thank you.
And please pick up your thank you gift.